Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we cover the main 3 early game commanders you can consider building. In the early game, commanders are so much weaker than the Season of Conquest that oftentimes there's little reason to invest, and in fact, there's so poor uses of universal sculptures that they're mostly avoided. But for those itching to get commanders, there are a few commanders you can have that have field viability late in the game. First is YSG. His AoE is huge, skill damage equally so, and although he isn't as good as Liang, he's still a great option for your second march. Next is Alexander. While fragile, he has a massive 30% damage vulnerability debuff on his active skill, which is insanely great at any level, so long as you can protect him. While he isn't the top tier march, he's a great support pair. Last, but certainly not least, we have Saladin. Saladin is great as a third march pair option, as he has good tankiness and only has to be 5551, which saves you around 300 sculptures early on. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're covering the best free-to-play investments by troop type. First, for infantry, we have Scipio Prime. Even with the new commander releases, Scipio Prime just has that top-notch health debuff on his active skill, and smite damage commanders or not, he's not going to fall completely off the face of the earth, since debuffs are so universally strong. Next, for archers, we have Liang. Liang is YSG 2.0, and a pretty safe bet for free-to-play players. Huge AoE, good survivability, and synchronization with basically every other archer commander, including YSG, make for him to be a pretty safe bet. And last, but certainly not least, for cavalry, we have Nevsky. Poe could go here too as a good single pair, but Nevsky just covers so much that even if you wanted to go branch out to a different role, Nevsky would probably be the right mix for it. He's synonymous with the cavalry meta, and the defense break on his primary is nothing to laugh at. And he's even going to be here for quite a while, even with Woe. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're covering the different field archetypes and their roles. When it comes to the field, you have a wide variety of pairs. Each pair has its own pros and cons, but they ultimately fall into 3 main archetypes, with some overlap. First, you have the damage dealers. This is plain and simple. These pairs are here to deal damage and put out as much hurt on the enemy as possible. This comes at the cost of being fragile, and focusing on these damage dealers is usually a scary prospect for them. Next, we have supports. These marches aren't the strongest, but they carry powerful bonuses and debuffs to help allies defeat enemies more easily. Whether it's a damage buff, health debuff, or anything in between, supports live to help their allies, and they pay a price for it in severe fragility. Last, but certainly not least, we have the tanks. These marches are incredibly sturdy and do not take damage easily. However, they don't have a ton of damage output, even having less damage than support marches, so they serve as a focus point for the enemy, acting as a speed bump of sorts, and trying to keep them focused on the... Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we cover early garrison options for events like Shadow Legion. When it comes to the early game, the garrisons are just not typically worth investing in, as the power creep is just so crazy. However, there are several events that could really use garrisons like Shadow Legion, so I'll quickly go over the most cost-effective options. First, Sun Tzu is the best epic garrison hands down. The damage reduction in AoE make him a nightmare for any event, and the AoE can tag many nearby enemies. Tack on that he has access to the skill tree and garrison tree, and he's just top notch for early defense. Second, YSG is a great option that does have field use. In the late game, you could pair him with Boudica Prime and Hermann Prime if you do build him, and his AoE is just super great, whether you're using him for Shadow Legion or another event that involves city defense. Last but certainly not least, if you don't want to build YSG, just go with the commander that benefits your main troop type in your city the most. So if you're cavalry, find a good cavalry commander. If you're archers, find a good archer commander. This is a Testudo formation review. Testudo is released alongside Circle Formation, and here are some of the basics if you missed my long format video. First, the base ability is a 5% damage reduction when shielded and 2.5% healing boost. This is good if you can maintain 40% or more shield uptime, as it then becomes better than Hollow Square's base value. For specialty inscriptions, we have 17.5% shielding that can go up to 24.5% on certain abilities, 14% healing that can go up to 21%, 5% counterattack damage, 5% skill damage reduction, and 3.5% damage dealt when you're healed or shielded. Overall, the formation gives good survivability, but is somewhat dependent on healing to reach its full potential, because Hollow Square does this, but slightly better because straight damage reductions. In the meta, it has a specifically distinct niche with Gorgo Xeno and Xeno Hera, but outside of that, it's not nearly as broad of a commander formation as Hollow Square is. So when it comes to the new archers with the heals, there's a lot of debate about Testudo or Circle. because both increase healing, but of course Testudo increases at a lower rate. So when should you use each in each case? So I'm going to quickly go over the basics. First, if you're using both the new commanders, circle formation is probably the way to go. Both have heals, so then you get double the usefulness. That also means you get double the boost in healing and double the boost on everything. So that's where you'll have the most benefit. However, if you are using Hera or any other shielding commander in a garrison or in any other capacity, Testudo starts to become the better one. The 5% less damage taken means there's fewer wounded units, which means the reduced healing you receive is really not as significant because the damage reduction means you have less units to heal. And while you'll still deal more damage because the true damage trigger, you'll still have more units overall with Testudo. Here are the 3 most broken inscriptions that are non-specialty. First, of course, we have Ward. This is one of my favorites. It is a 5% damage taken reduction for 3 seconds on a 5-second cooldown on skill use. That's a 60% uptime if you can get consistent skill uses, and it's pretty much one of the better ways to reduce damage because it's all damage. Next, we have Respite. Similar, but you have on a basic attack. So when you're being swarmed, you have a 10% chance when you get hit with any basic attack to reduce damage by 10% for 2 seconds. That means when you're swarmed, you can have a potentially 40% uptime of a 10% damage reduction. Last, but certainly not least, we have anything that reduces damage, whether it's all damage, counterattack damage, skill damage. Any damage you can reduce is huge, so if you could stack these on inscriptions, it is completely valuable and worthwhile. Here's why Gorgo tends to be a little more shaky when it comes to mixed troops. Gorgo is still a huge player in the meta, and Gorgo Hera is the biggest player in that meta right now, pending these new archers. But also, ironically, she tends to struggle with mixed troops. This is for a couple of different reasons. First, of course, you have Hold the Line, which is a talent that is completely dependent on being fully infantry. Therefore, having mixed units, you cannot use literally the best talent in this tree. And because of that, you get a lot weaker talent return when you do mixed garrisons with Gorgo. Second, her secondary tree, the defense tree, is just not very good. Whether you have support or skill tree on these other commander pairs, Gorgo has weak talents. So that is really something that holds back, and where leadership garrisons really need you to make up for. That being said, Gorgo is still a huge player, as a testament to how loaded her kit is. Here are the best troop types to pair with Hera based on commander synchronization. Note that this is based on talent and commander synchronization rather than individual pairs. So while Gorgo Hera is the strongest in the meta, it doesn't necessarily synchronize as well as other pairings. That being said, it's still the strongest. In third place, we have infantry. As I mentioned, the talent synchronization is really the big knock here, as the best infantry talent needs you to have full infantry. So because of that, you are put at a disadvantage and you lose out on that talent. That being said, ironically, infantry mixed garrisons tend to be some of the most prevalent and strongest. Next, we have archers. Archers have a lot more kits that are specific to having only archers, whether you're talking about Dido, Liang, or anything in between. So having a mixed garrison is a natural conflict. And of course, in first, we have cavalry. There's not nearly as much that needs to be cavalry only, besides Nevsky, so this gets an easy mix to garrison setup. Here are 3 must-avoid commanders in the early game. When you talk about the early game, the best thing you could do is save sculptures. And sometimes you're going to spend them, but here are commanders you absolutely cannot be caught spending commander sculptures on right now. First is Khan. And this hurts me because it's one of the first cavalry commanders I expertised, but he just does not scale well at all. And you will be way behind if you build him and you invest all those sculptures into him. Next, we have Edward. Edward is just way too fragile and doesn't have any translation into the late game. So if you invest in him in this stage of the game, you're just basically wasting those sculptures, whereas you could just get by with other commanders. And last, and probably least, are pretty much the whole roster of leadership commanders in the early stages. Whether they're talking about Charlemagne, Wu, or otherwise, they just don't scale nearly as well, and they're just not good investments that have any real value. Here's what your favorite troop archetype says about you. If your favorite troop archetype is support, you probably aren't interested into the reports, and you probably don't keep a lot of them. Or you're not really interested in the severely wounded score at the end of your KvK. But you are interested in something very important. and that's the abstracts, how your field presence moves, or better yet, how much better they do while you're in the field with them. While you may not have the highest trades, the best gear, the most optimized armaments and formations, you're willing to do whatever it takes, sacrifice whatever is needed, and be the ultimate team player to help your team succeed. Deep down, no matter what your report says, you know that your team is succeeding because you're helping them, and you know they're better off having you on the field, and that's completely okay with you. And just know, deep down, we see you. Thank you, supports. If you're in a kingdom like mine, you have contribution goals through DKP or through another system set by your kingdom. So in today's video, I wanted to cover the easiest ways to hit those goals. First, of course, is just through filling rallies and garrisons. You'll get some KP, but you'll also mainly get deads. Rallies take deads, while garrisons take a portion as deads. But in both cases, this is a crucial part of your role as a kingdom member, and your contribution system will reflect that. So getting in on garrisons and rallies early and often will make your contribution requirement a breeze, while making it easier for other players. Second is making it to ruins and altars. These are massive fights, but relatively forgiving on cost, since you typically only have one march to the area that you can lose at once, and only 2 or 3 in rotation. So this keeps hospital bills low and stacking fairly high. Last, but certainly not least, is activity. Can't contribute if you're not playing. This doesn't mean you have to be on 24/7, but still try to set some time away during KvK to be there and to fight, because it'll make it a lot easier to build up during that time. So with the release of the new true damage dealing commanders, there's a lot of hype about them being so strong. But there is something interesting I wanted to point out, and really the answer is right in front of us, and that health and damage reductions are the natural counters. So when you look at the skills, and you actually click true damage is not affected by the attacking troop's attack or the defending troop's defense. So that makes 2 things. One, your attack unit on your attacking march, if you are the one using this true damage, is not going to increase any of the damage. But the other thing is, it's ignoring the defense. That means it doesn't ignore health, and it does not ignore damage reduction when it's all damage reduction. So that's something important to consider, because that means that health will remain the top defensive stat to keep yourself alive, and really health is going to be that natural counter, and it's going to re-solidify its position as a very strong counter to this, as well as any other type of damage source.